Right, so I have a really interesting test today. We're going to look at Kodak 400TX 35mm legendary black and white film, and I'm going to photograph a series of scenes with my Yashica T4 Super. Great camera, wicked sharp lens. And then we're going to compare those images scanned on my Imicon scanner with images made in 3 different digital cameras. And we're going to see what resolution of digital camera, what type of sensor, and just how close with emulation software can we get, not just on the screen, but into print, to look like 400TX. So the 3 digital cameras that we're going to use, one is the Ricoh GRD4 CCD 10 megapixel. I've done several videos on it here recently. Great camera. I love the look. I'm curious to see how close I can get it. Then we're also going to use the Ricoh GR3. It's got an APS-C size CMOS sensor. We're going to see just how close that can get to the look of 400TX. And then I just found out I'm going to have access to a Leica M11P with a 28mm lens this evening, so we'll also be able to do that. And we're going to see these files side by side. Then we're going to look at a couple different emulation softwares that I have to see which one dials it in the best on a screen. Then we're going to make prints, and we're going to make pretty good size prints, lay them side by side, and see, is it possible in 2025 to emulate the look of 400TX. All right, so the first image we're looking at, this is from my Yashica T4 Super. This is Kodak 400TX processed in D76 1:1 classic film developer combination. It was then scanned on my Imicon 646 at about 5,000 DPI and brought it into Photoshop. Basic, black and white workflow, and here it is, and I think it looks great. It has all the things that you would expect from a Tri-X. It's got some snap, some bite, the grain is really pretty. It's not sharp the way like T-Max 100 is or some Delta films are. It has that classic sharpness. Now, when I was contemplating which emulation software to use, I ran some files through 3 or 4 different programs, and what I didn't like about some of them was that they would add grain and they would add contrast, but they wouldn't deal with the detail of the image. And the reality is, when you're working with cameras of 20, 30, 40, 60 megapixels, that's way more resolution than is ever going to be in 400 speed Tri-X and 35mm. It just is. And so I ended up settling on Real Grain 3 by ImageNomics. And by the way, I pay for all my film, all my software, everything. So there's no sponsor for this video, never will be, except for me. So please like and subscribe if you would, please. That'd be great. So if we look at now the first image that was done in ImageNomics, this is once again with the Ricoh GR3, and it looks really good. But when you zoom into the eyes, what you see is there's an incredible amount of sharpness in those glasses and in her skin tone. And that's not something that we saw to that degree in the Yashica T4 400TX film image. The reality is that Ricoh GR3 is recording more information and more micro detail information than 400 speed 35mm Tri-X is going to. And so if I show you them now side by side, they both feel really good, but the Tri-X, it's a little more open, and the grain and everything has the right amount of detail for a 400 speed 35mm black and white film, whereas the Ricoh GR3, even with the little bit of softening that the ImageNomics software runs, it still isn't quite right. Now, let's take a look at that same file, and this is in the Ricoh GRD4, which is my 2011 CCD camera at only 10 megapixels. And that feels a lot better because at 10 megapixels, and I'm assuming 12 and 13 megapixels would probably be about the same, the resolution feels more like a 400 speed, black and white film. It's actually quite sharp, the GRD4, and I could have emulated T-Max 100, all sorts of stuff, and it would really fit a lot of those type of films in 35mm. But when you start looking at that Ricoh GR3, boy, that level of resolution that we just saw is really something, you're more into almost medium format territory, or getting close to. It's just the resolution is just so good. Now if we compare the Yashica T4 to the GRD4, look at how much better the two look. The resolution is much more similar. The feeling is much more similar. Okay, so let's move on to our next test image. This is one where I shot Eve at a friend's house. Once again, this was with the Yashica T4 Super, processed in D76 1:1, 400 Tri-X, scanned on the Imicon at about 5,000 DPI. And it has that classic Tri-X look. Now, of course, I could process this image in the computer a million different ways. I could really jack up the contrast, I could do all sorts of stuff, but I really felt that this felt proper film-like grayscale to me. And I like sort of the balance, I like her skin rendering, and I just like how it feels overall. So the next image that we're gonna look at is the, once again, the Ricoh GR3 with its larger APS-C sensor. And what you can see is it has an awful lot of clarity, an awful lot of detail. And it doesn't look bad, it just doesn't look like 400 TX. It's like a much bigger version of 400 TX than 35. And here we are looking at, once again, a side-by-side. You can see the gray tonality is similar. However, the resolution in her glasses and in her hair on the GR3 is far exceeding what 400 TX in my Yashica T4 could ever render. And so that's just telling me that that once again, the larger APS sensor is just rendering more detail than the actual film would. But now if we look at the Ricoh GRD4, once again, 10 megapixel CCD, this is what we get. And that to me looks better. I think it's still on the high end, though she is a little closer in this frame than she was in the film frame. That was just the difference of 35mm versus 28mm lens. I was trying to get it close. But this one looks really good to me. If we do it as a side-by-side, it looks closer. Her hair doesn't show all the micro strands the way it doesn't show all the micro strands in the GR3. The GR3 has every little hair perfectly rendered, whereas here, the hair and those micro details feel just better to my eye. Next, we're gonna look at a Leica M11P. So this is a 60 megapixel capture made to look like 400 TX. And there's just too much data here. I mean, this is more like medium format for sure tracks. I mean, look at the detail in her glasses and in her face. And this is with it being softened just a little tiny bit and adding the grain. I mean, I was kind of freaked out, I have to be really honest, with how much detail was in the M11. I was just, it was too much. It was just way too much for my eye. And I felt the same way almost about the GR3. I will say though, I'm super impressed with, if you're looking for sharp and you want really clean and you don't give a crap about a film-like look, the GR3 really is incredible and it packs an awful lot into that little tiny box. It was really incredible. The Leica has more, but it's a much bigger and significantly more expensive camera. Now let's zoom in to the next image side by side. Again, on the left, you've got the Yashica T4 Super, and on the right, you've got the Leica M11. And I think the difference is pretty tremendous. So for me, the camera that on a screen felt the most like the Tri-X was the older 2011 CCD-based GRD4. That one felt the most similar. And an interesting test would be is if you took a Leica M11P and then turned the resolution down to 18 megapixels, which you can do, would that be more similar as well? All right, I couldn't help myself. I decided to quickly do the 3 different megapixel resolution shots that I was just talking about with the M11P. So the first one we're looking at here is a 60 megapixel capture. Once again, I think there's just too much information in terms of the micro detail if you're trying to say this is 35mm. Maybe 6, 7, something like that, but the grain's right. It's just the resolution is just so high of what it's resolving, it just doesn't feel right. Now we're looking at 36 megapixels. It's better. It's getting better, but it's still really, really crisp to be a 35mm, and I think it's just still doesn't feel like 35mm 400 TX. But on this final one here, this is the 18 megapixel. This is closer. I think it's still maybe a little bit too much, but we're dialed in now better than we were at the 60. So if you've got an M11 and you want to have something look like 35mm film, I would absolutely recommend dumping it down to the 18 megapixel capture and shooting it that way. But if you don't care about that, enjoy the 60 megapixels worth of resolution. It's really beautiful and kind of scary. Okay, so here's the M11P file with no emulation at all. And it is crazy scary, 60 megapixel scary. The detail and the micro contrast are like nuts. I mean, it just is way beyond Tri-X. But check out the GR3. The GR3, fraction of the cost, it is so good. I mean, the fact that it doesn't have an AA filter, look at the sharpness of the hair behind her head. But there's no way that looks like Tri-X, and that's why it's difficult with these high-resolution materials to try to emulate the look of Tri-X. But let's take a look at some prints. So here's our 4 images printed. And printed on my Canon printer downstairs, and they're really beautiful. And I always tell people, if you're only looking at reviews and only seeing your images on a screen, you're really missing out. You have to see a print. Everything changes in a print. The image becomes solid, and it's just so important to review the quality of your equipment and the look that you're going for from a print and not just the digital file. So at the top image here, this is from the Yashica T4 Super. Once again, this is 20 by 27 inches. I never would have printed Tri-X in 35 millimeter this big in the traditional darkroom days. It just is something I wouldn't do, but boy, it looks really good. Absolutely beautiful, has that classic Tri-X pop that we're used to. Now, this is the GRD4. This is the CCD version from 2011, and I think it looks great. It really has closer to the feel of film Tri-X than the other two. The CCD sensor, the lower resolution, the fact that if you look behind her head here, there's no hair rendering. Same as there isn't in the actual film file. But when we look at the GR3, and I get the camera to go in focus, there's absolutely hair back here rendering. Same thing is true for sure on the M11. You're getting all that extra data. The look of film, and if that actually matters to you, but all of these images look great. I mean, I look at the GRD4, the GR3, and the M11P, they all look really good. Of course, film has its own look. And no matter how much you emulate, there's still a different quality to a film scan print. I think that the GRD4 has the most film look. I think the GR3 is a incredibly great value for a camera. I mean, so small, so beautiful. The three-dimensional quality of the image is great. And the sharpness, absolutely, is on par with what I'm seeing from the Leica M11P. Depending on the look that you want for your work, if you're trying to emulate the look of film, or if you don't care about that, you like sort of the modern hyper aesthetic that you can get from these high resolution cameras, then that's great. I'm going to show you one more comparison of prints at a smaller scale, because once again, these are printed really big. You know, if we were working at a smaller, more traditional size, let's say 11 by 15 or something like that, how would they look then? All right, so one last test. These are much smaller images. They're 11 by 15. And the top one is the GRD4, middle is the film, and the bottom is the GR3. Now, what you can see when you get up to the images at the smaller scale is that the GRD4 is still really sharp. Even with the Tri-X emulation, the glasses and the dimensional quality is really good. It's definitely higher res than my Yashica T4 with the 400TX, but the overall feeling of the two is more similar. When I get down to the GR3, I mean, it's incredible. The amount of sharpness and clarity is just insane, but it doesn't have quite the feeling that I'm getting out of the GRD4. So at this smaller scale, I still feel that the GRD4 is closer to the Tri-X, but boy, it's still really sharp in a way that my 400TX is not. So over these last few days, I've been conducting these tests and they have genuinely shaken me. I'm deeply curious about the direction of photography now in 2025. I've been comparing these three cameras, the Leica M11P, the Ricoh GR3, and the Ricoh GRD4 from 2011 with its legendary 10 megapixel CCD sensor. Alongside them, I've been looking at good old Kodak Tri-X 400 processed in D76 1:1. And here's what I think I found. Replicating the look and feel of film, especially something as iconic as Tri-X, is nearly impossible with today's top-tier digital cameras. Why? because they're simply too good when it comes to resolution. Let me explain. When you shoot with the Leica M11P, what you get is an image that's almost unnervingly sharp. The micro detail, the micro contrast are off the charts. It doesn't matter what lens you put on it, it cuts through the scene with clinical precision. And while that is technically impressive, it's also the very thing that makes it difficult to achieve that classic filmic feel. The images are so sharp, so perfect, that no amount of digital grain or post-processing seems to be able to bring them back to the aesthetic world of an analog film. Even the Ricoh GR3, with its 24 megapixel APS-C CMOS sensor and no AA filter, delivers an image so crisp and contrasty that it almost feels too clean. It's beautiful, yes, but unsettling. It's not just the detail, it's the hyper detail. These images feel louder than life, and maybe that's part of the problem. In contrast, the GRD4 from 2011, with only 10 megapixels and a CCD, has an elegance that feels closer to film. There's a softness, there's a gentler fall off in some of the tones, and of course, Ricoh Tri-X has depth and irregularity and humanity that no software seems to be able to mimic convincingly. This brings me to a larger question, and it's one that I've been thinking about a lot. Has our visual aesthetic as a culture changed? We know film photography has seen a resurgence over the past 5 or 6 years, but in the grand scheme, it's still a tiny sliver of the overall photo market. Digital dominates, and yet many of today's digital tools and presets aim to emulate film, but they can't fully hide the fact that the underlying image is just too sharp. Most emulation software simply overlays grain onto razor-sharp digital files. It feels fake, it looks fake, and we can see that it is fake. That's why I turned to ImageNomics for this test. It was the only software I found that actually reduced the structural detail in the digital file in a meaningful way before applying the grain. It felt closer to the real thing. Definitely not perfect, but better. Because true film isn't just about grain. It's about the relationship between grain, light, focus, and depth. It's about imperfection. I don't know what all this means just yet. I'm still processing, pun intended, but what I do know is that we are living in a time when cameras are producing images that are so sharp, so clinically perfect, that it may be time to ask, is this the look that we want for photography going forward? Or is there a growing desire, conscious or not, for images that feel less precise and more emotional? The masters, Kudelka, Cartier-Bresson, early Salgado work to name a few, shot on film. Their images breathe. They have edges that aren't always sharp, grain that adds to the story. And I worry that we're losing that sensibility in favor of sheer technical brilliance. This is just me thinking aloud, but maybe this is something we should all sit with. Thank you very much for listening. Now go shoot some film and maybe a digital picture or two.